Hi, quite a while ago I bought this Micsig tablet scope, mostly for use away from the workshop on site, and I found it really good actually. It's definitely my go-to portable scope. It's nice and responsive, it's got sort of intensity graded display, they now have serial decode on there. And last time I reviewed it, I sort of concluded that given the limitations of being touchscreen only, you know, they've done a pretty decent job. Some people just can't live without knobs. So Micsig have brought out a new model and they've kindly sent me this to have a look at. This is the STO series, which is basically the T-Book Mini with knobs on. And the functionality is pretty much the same generally, but obviously we've now got an alternate knob user interface. There's a few things they've added to the T-Book Mini over sort of various firmware updates. I'll sort of cover some of those as well, but I'm mostly going to look at the difference between this and the older unit, as well as the addition of the knobs. There's a few other differences in terms of interfacing and so on. We've got 12 volt DC power, USB device, USB host for memory devices, HDMI, which is now fully implemented, and it's actually on a proper full-size connector. The other one had one of those micro connectors, which would always be a bit fragile, and it's got LAN. It also has Wi-Fi built in. Tilt stand is slightly different. Minor complaints is it only has a single angle. Now the one issue here is that it does have a very shiny screen, so it's very prone to sort of picking up reflections, and with a fixed angle, if you're using it on the bench, that may or may not be an issue. But I mean, you could always put a anti-reflective screen protector on there if that's a huge problem. And again, on the top you've got the 4-channel inputs and aux out, which as far as I can tell only does trigger out. There's no obvious other functionality. There's a single fan on the back which appears to be temperature controlled, because I haven't actually noticed it running yet, so you don't have the issue of the fan noise. The other ones, the T-Book Mini's got a fairly noticeable fan noise. It's actually got two small fans in there, which are a bit noisier than sort of one larger one. It comes with these probes. These are actually quite nice. It's got a nice sort of really flexible cable on it. They're ×10 only, not the switchable ones, which I'm not a big fan of the switchable ones because the switch actually causes issues. It's a fixed, not springy probe. I don't like the springy ones because they're generally not. You can't really sort of push them hard enough. But it's got a very sharp point, so good for scraping, solder resist, and so on. And the probes also come with some low impedance grounding springs, so these just sort of slip over the end so you can connect to a local ground for high frequency probing. That's a bit unusual in sort of lower cost sort of Chinese products, so they've put a bit of thought into that. The ground lead, as far as I can tell, this doesn't actually seem to detach unless I've just not figured out how it's supposed to come off. It might be an issue because eventually this is going to sort of wear out, and I'm not quite sure how you'd fix that if it did. There's also the fairly sort of normal insulating thing, so this is when you want to, for example, probe individual pins on a chip without shorting them. It just gives you just sort of the little spike. Also included are these sort of pretty coloured BNC condoms. I'm not really sure those are particularly useful. Don't really see that sort of sealing off BNCs is a huge deal. The other thing they sent, this is not included as standard, this is an extra, this is a carrying case, which it's actually quite nice. It doesn't have the problem with some carrying cases, which is where they're just too ridiculously padded. This is just big enough. You've got space for the scope, space for the power supply, and a pouch for the probe. So this is quite a nice size. For my old T-Book, I actually found this old laptop case, which is ideal. So, yeah, you may be able to find a laptop case the same size, but you know, this is just quite a nice case for it. It's just about right. So the quality seems really good. It seems really nicely made. There's a shoulder strap as well, so although yeah, this is something you normally have this as well as other gear, yeah, this isn't sort of sufficiently too big and padded that it would take up a ridiculous amount of space in a sort of tool case with other stuff. So yeah, it's quite a nice little case. Now, I covered most of the basic scope functionality in the T-Book Mini review, so I'm just going to look at really the differences. One nice thing now, it does have serial decode. Now, I believe this is an option, but looking at a few adverts, this seems to be quite often bundled in, and certainly in looking at the option pricing for the T-Book Mini, it was a very cheap option. It was, I think, something like $30 or $40 for all the decode, so it's either included or a fairly sort of low-cost extra. And the decodes available are UART Lin CAN SPI ²C, 429 and 1553B, which are sort of fairly obscure sort of military type protocols, but yeah, UART SPI and I2C are the big ones that you're going to want a lot of the time. One minor annoyance, which is particularly evident on the serial decode, is that there is no fine adjust on the horizontal time base, depending on your actual baud rate timing. So for example here we're not getting a huge amount of data on screen. The problem is that the next time base up doesn't show it at all. It would be nice to set the time base somewhere between those, and there isn't any way of doing that, unfortunately. What's surprising, the scale on most scopes, you can switch the scale between coarse and fine by clicking the time base knob. Now these do actually have clicks, but they just on the time base and also on the vertical scale, those clicks just don't do anything at all. Maybe they will on future firmware versions. The horizontal positions do what you'd expect. They sort of have a zero function, but so those are currently unused, but maybe they'll add some functionality to those in future firmware updates. The other thing which they haven't done, obviously with a scope this size you're not going to have separate position gain for every channel, so you select the channel that you want to adjust, so you select it and you then adjust that channel. Now the only indication of what's currently selected is over here on the left hand side. You just get this little marker that fills in. What they haven't done is what both Rode and Schwartz, and also on the new Keysight 4-channel 1000 series, where they actually have a LED to actually tell you what that knob does in terms of colour. So that would have been a nice addition, but it's not a huge problem. It's really a case of getting used to it. But the other thing is they're not totally consistent. The one nice thing about the Rode and Schwartz is that things like references, serial decodes are just treated as other channels, and the gain and position knobs affect those. This isn't quite the case. You can move the serial decode position. It's only that the serial decodes are basically shifted, although you've got the 4 channels reference and maths. There's also a shift key, and you can get straight to the serial menus using these shift functions. So sort of shift function goes there, but when it's in that mode it doesn't regard that as a selected channel, so that the position knob still refers to the last analog channel you selected, not the serial decode function. Again, it's a minor thing, but it's just it'd be nice to have a bit of consistency. But at least you can move these. You can't scale them vertically, unfortunately, so at least you can sort of move them around to position them where you want them. There's 2 serial decodes available. If you want both sides of a lucky you art thing, you use both channels. The maths channels they do regard as normal channels, so again you've got position and size on that, so the maths functions they're just the basic any 2 channels, plus minus, divide, multiply, and there's also FFT functionality on there. And reference waveforms, this is, again, I may have missed something. This is slightly annoying in that you can turn on and off various reference waveforms. What you can't, within the reference, there's no facility just to capture an existing waveform. You basically have to use the save function. You have to basically use this save function, which saves the waveform into a file name. The problem is that when you recall it into a reference waveform, you've got to do it by name. You can't, you've got a time and date when it was saved, but it's a bit annoying to actually, if you want to literally save it and recall it immediately, you've got to figure out which one it is. Again, you can set the position and the size of those reference waveforms, and obviously like most scopes that have buttons, as well as these buttons selecting which channel is currently being adjusted, they also do a double press, just turns them on and off, which again is pretty standard now in most scopes. And with the buttons there is a facility to turn the touch facility off, because of course one of the nice things about a sort of completely portable battery powered scope is that you can use it in a sort of floating mode, or you might want to use it in electrically noisy environments which might cause problems with a touchscreen. So there is a function to turn the touchscreen off completely, so it just doesn't do anything. Another option for controlling it is you can plug a USB mouse in, and when you do that you get a cursor. You also get this little menu which is popped up on the right button. This basically duplicates the few fixed buttons on the T-Book Mini. So you've got run, stop, single, so it's duplicating these buttons on the right hand side. The home button. Actually, what I'm not seeing though is the measure button here. So as far as I can see, you can't actually get into the menus for this. I think that they've missed something out on this. So yeah, it looks like maybe the mouse functionality isn't quite fully there. They need to have a measure button there just to be able to pull up these quite important menus. So there are things you can't get to. So I'm not really sure why you'd want to drive it with a mouse, but at the moment it looks like it's not totally completely implemented. As with the T-Book Mini, a lot of functions are in sort of one fairly big menu, so you've got measure functions, the various save, loading, saving of waveforms and displays and so on. Display functionality, which we'll come back to because there's a few things that they could probably improve here. Trigger, I mean, there are dedicated buttons, so for example if I hit the trigger menu it goes straight to that sub menu, but that is actually a sub menu of this main menu. And you've got a decent selection of trigger functionality, pulse width, combinatorial logic, nth edge, run, slope, pretty much all the triggers are plus triggering on decodes. So pretty much, yeah, all the trigger functionality you'd expect. Of course there isn't a line trigger because there's no main supply. A few parameters to specify how the auto scale works. There's a frequency meter available. And this appears to be a hardware frequency meter, which isn't tied to the trigger channel, I don't believe. There are some scopes where it'll only count on the trigger channel, but I believe, yeah, this will trigger on any channel. And you've got trigger hold off. One slight annoyance is you've got like a coarse and fine adjust on this, but what you can't do is just tap on that and type a value in, because sometimes on hold off, you know, you might know that your waveform or your burst is a particular length, and it'd be nice just to be able to type that in as a numeric value, but it doesn't now allow you to do that, which is just a minor irritation. It'd be nice if they sorted that out. Again, it would be nice if you could just like click on there and type in like a specific time-based value. The other thing in terms of user interface is that, for example, on user-defined baud rates, you can type a value in. Let's say that I happen to notice a 3 mega baud. Now what I'd expect to happen is if I hit 3, when I hit M, I'd expect it to combine enter as well, but it doesn't. You have to hit enter separately, which is just a slight, again, a minor annoyance. Is a bit unnecessary. Most keyboard touchscreen overlays tend to sort of take that suffix as being your enter. I don't know whether you can actually treat that as a decimal. So if I do 3M5, yeah, it doesn't even regard that as a decimal point, so I don't see any point in it not having, just going straight into that. It doesn't seem to colour code errors. I've just deliberately set that to the wrong baud rate, and it's just decoding rubbish rather than actually giving like positive indication of things like framing errors. When the menu's on screen, just touching anywhere else on the screen will make the menu disappear. In addition to the top menu, there's also a bottom menu with this button that just seems to be a few sort of fairly random things. You've got screenshot, which is fairly common, but the other really interesting thing is very unusual. It's video record. It will actually record continuous video of the waveforms. Now I can see that could be really useful, of course, in that some problems, you know, you might want to leave it running, looking for a very rare problem. So to be able to actually produce video of the scope recording, I think is a really useful facility. Apparently it's got a few gigs of internal memory, so it can actually store quite a substantial amount of time there. It will also save video to an external USB stick. The file format is AVI, and as far as I can tell it's H.264 format. An 18-second recording took about 7 megabytes. But so I think it's a really interesting and I think fairly unique facility. I'm not aware of any other scopes that do that, so I think for like fault finding type applications that could be a really powerful feature. Now the other things in this bottom menu are the measure all. Now this is a really stupid place to put this. Like most scopes, there's a way of just turning on just a bunch of all the measurements in one go. So it does, yeah, period, frequency, your isotone, all that stuff. But having it there rather than in the measure menu is just daft. It seems to select the channel, basically it's just the currently selected channel that it does the measurements on. But why is that not in the measurement? You know, you press measure, because I accidentally turned this on and then I couldn't figure out how on earth to turn it off again, because I was looking in the measure menu and there's, you know, you'd expect it to be, yeah, somewhere here to say all on, all off, but no, it's just in a completely different menu, which is just ridiculous, and that's just dumb. The other facility it's got built in, this is like a serial dump type mode. So it can act a bit like a serial terminal. It'll also show 2 serial streams with different colours. So for example, if you've got a 2-way transaction, it actually colours them differently. But it seems to swap them rather than character by character. It seems to actually swap them acquisition by acquisition. I've now set up both decodes, decoding the same channel in the same format. So we've actually got exactly the same data going to both of them. But if you then look at this list of display, what I'd expect, yeah, if it was actually truly showing everything in real time, I'd see like MM, II, KKs to actually happen. But what you actually what you do see when you go S1 and S2, it looks like, you know, it seems to be the whole string. So it isn't. Oops, come on, focus. You know, you see sort of the string sort of fairly chopped. So I think what's happening is it's taking one whole acquisition and sort of showing those alternately rather than actually doing it in real time. So there doesn't appear to be any actual time stamping, but you know, again, this is a facility that most scopes don't have. Just a quick way of just giving a serial terminal display, I think it is useful, but the scope to make it even more useful, it had like proper time stamping and more accurate timing information. But the other thing is both serials have to be in the same format. So for example, you can't do hex and ASCII on the same display. They have to be they have to be in the same format, but it does color code them to channel. So I think that's quite a useful facility. Again, I think it would make more sense to actually have that in the serial menu rather than this just random everything else menu, but it's not a huge deal once you're used to it. And something I quite often find annoying on scopes, other than like the really big main brands, is it's quite unusual to have the facility to set the trigger point on the screen. Now this is the default way that most scopes work. It sets the trigger at the center so you can see what's going on before and after the trigger, which is pretty much any scope, that's the default behavior. Now in practice that's actually not that useful in terms of maximizing screen area, because most of the time you're either interested in what happened before the trigger or after the trigger. So what you really want a lot of the time is to have your reference point over here. The problem is, now obviously you can move that by moving the scale, but of course as soon as you then adjust your time base, your reference point disappears, and it does have a click to 0. Now this is actually better in that there is a way of getting around that. If we go into display, now a lot of scopes it will say, for example the Rohde & Schwarz on the Keysight, certainly you can set the reference point to center, one division from the left or one division from the right. This is slightly different in that this allows you to set it to the trigger position. So now what happens is, although it still defaults to the center there, if you then move it over to the left, the reference is now on the trigger. So now when we move it to show most of the post-trigger data on the screen, it now actually scales correctly. So it would be nice to have that option of the left-right option, but at least this does give you that facility to get basically the same functionality. Well, one of the really nice features about these tablet scopes is, like a lot of modern scopes, they have an intensity graded display, which basically, if you don't know, is produced by taking multiple waveforms per screen update and grading the display intensity according to how many times a particular pixel is lit in that frame, a bit like an old analog scope. So what we're seeing, this is a frequency modulated 1 megahertz sine wave. It's triggering multiple times per frame, so we're actually seeing sort of multiple waveforms in each frame capture. We have a waveform intensity control. Again, this is pretty common. So for example, if we turn it full up, then literally any pixel which is lit at any time comes at full brightness. So that's very useful for catching occasional glitches. Probably the biggest use cases of this functionality is for catching very, very infrequent glitches. But you can also reduce it to give you a more sort of analog-like display. The other thing this scope has, which the Mini doesn't have, is it's actually got a color version, so you can basically, instead of just grading it based on intensity, you can actually get like a sort of heat map type diagram. Again, we saw this in the Rohde & Schwarz as well. And again, if you go to the waveform intensity control, we can adjust that. It's slightly annoying that it, while you're adjusting it, it pauses the acquisition, but so it means you can get some indication of the relative frequency of the occurrence of certain phenomena. And I'm using a sine wave here because it's easy to demonstrate. In practice this will probably be more commonly used for infrequently occurring pulses, that sort of thing. There's something a bit strange the way they've implemented it, and there's basically two factors here. One thing they've done is they've changed the default persistence. When I first tried this, I was sort of trying to test this functionality, and I wasn't really getting anything. I was just getting a single sine wave. And one thing I'm doing here, incidentally, on channel 2, I'm taking the trigger out into another input so you can actually see how fast it's triggering. We can see here it's only triggering at 50 Hz, so it's triggering like, the older style scopes, which just produce one trigger per display. And I thought, what's going on here? Because I knew the older, the T-Book Mini had proper intensity display. It turns out that there's sort of two factors in play here. The immediate one is they've changed the default behaviour, because on the T-Book Mini its default behaviour was to turn persistence on with about 500 millisecond persistence display. But what they seem to have done is they seem to have conflated the persistence and the intensity grading functionality. So now we've turned the persistence on, we're now getting a nice high 15 kilohertz trigger rate there, and if we actually have a look at the actual waveform of that, we can see that we are getting a very high rate of trigger most of the time, although if we then zoom back on that, we'll see that there is actually quite significant dead time, which is presumably when it's refreshing the screen. So it's not quite as good as, for example, the Keysight, which is pretty much the gold standard for high waveform rate, where it actually double buffers, so you get almost no dead time. So there is significant dead time, but it is capturing a lot of waveforms, so it's a not unreasonable compromise for a low-cost scope. But what's strange is it only does this high acquisition rate when you turn persistence on, and you can only get the persistence down to 100 milliseconds. Now I can't immediately think to what extent this might actually be a problem. So the default 500 millisecond persistence, if I just adjust the input waveform, you can definitely see some very, you can see this sort of slowing down and being quite laggy. That bouncing is just the signal generator I'm using. But so I think that was the default behaviour on the T-Book Mini, and I can understand why they changed it. Apparently they had sort of feedback from the customers, they didn't like the persistence being on by default. But the problem is that also turning that off also turned off the high waveform acquisition rate, which it seems a bit strange. So maybe they've basically used the same logic to implement both functionalities, which isn't necessarily a problem, but it would be nice if they'd actually let you turn it, like if this would go down to 20 milliseconds, i.e. a single frame, then that would give you pretty much the expected behaviour. Now, I mean, when it's down as low as 100 milliseconds, you do see some very, very slight persistence effects, but I think that's more cosmetic. I can't immediately think of any situation where having that persistence is actually a problem in terms of trying to figure out what's going on. But the fact that it's disabled by default, I think, is a problem. I think what they should do is enable it by default and set it to ideally less than 100 milliseconds, say 20 to 50 milliseconds, so you don't get that visible lag. If we sort of turn it up higher, then it'll become more obvious. Having persistence is very useful, again, for capturing infrequent events. So there are definitely times when you do want to have persistence, but it's very much something you enable when you want it and not when you don't. But I just don't quite understand why they seem to have just conflated the high waveform rate and the persistence functionality sort of unnecessarily. One thing I'm not hugely a fan of is the fact that to actually get to that waveform intensity, you have to basically pull up a menu and then go to that part of the menu. So it's buried quite deep for a function that you may actually want to use quite often. I certainly find on my Keysight I use this function a lot, just adjusting this intensity a lot. So it does have a few buttons that take you straight into like sub-menus, like the measure here, the trigger. I think I would have liked to actually have had a dedicated button to take me straight into that adjustment, or maybe had some way of accessing it via a knob. These knobs up here are basically used either for the cursor, but also they're in some cases used for sort of general selections. So for example, if you go to the brightness thing, the first time you can select, and it will select between the various items within that menu with that sort of yellow bar around it, and then you then click it, then it actually adjusts that function, but it's active when that menu is open. So that's not, it's an alternative to the touch. So for example, you'd use that if you had the touch disabled, but it doesn't give you the additional functionality, for example, of being able to adjust the waveform intensity when that menu isn't there. Right, so other things, apologies, this review's in a bit of a random order. I'm really busy at the moment, so I'm just sort of running through this sort of quickly in a few hours I've got available. Vertical menu, you've got the usual normal, average and peak detect acquisition modes, and averaging, you can actually select the number of averages. This home button down here just takes you to a menu that just does a variety of other things. It took me a while to figure out how to set the clock, but you just click on there and you set the clock there. It's got a built-in user guide, which is sort of fairly minimal, but I mean, it doesn't hurt to have that there. Photos, now obviously that's quite nice. You can browse through all the screenshots, but I think you can probably load photos onto it. So for example, if you're using this in a like sort of field service type context, you can maybe add some documentation in there. Video player, again, you can play back the waveform videos that you recorded. think. Oh, there you go. Yeah, so that's just playing back. It would be nice to actually have some indication that you were playing back. There's nothing on screen, it's just showing that. I'm not quite sure what the controls are on there. But again, you could potentially perhaps have sort of some training videos or something on there. I believe it does have audio on here, so that might be potentially useful. You probably have to use exactly the right codec, I would imagine. File manager stuff. There's this lock off facility, which I think is quite useful, in that when you click that, then in order to turn it on again, you have to press both the power and this unlock button. So that's quite a good protection against it getting accidentally turned on in transit, or if it's in a case or anything. So I think that's quite a handy little feature to avoid sort of suddenly finding you've got a dead battery. Startup time's pretty quick from cold. So bang, that's quite acceptable. There doesn't seem to be any like standby mode. It's just so when you hit the power button, you just get the two options: restart or shut down. Battery life is about 5 hours. I've done a couple of complete battery rundown tests. It's about 5 hours of continuous use. That might vary slightly depending on the number of channels and so on, but that's a pretty decent battery life. Internal memory, it's like as on the other one, it's 28 megapoints. If you go to this measure, you can actually specify the memory depth that you want to use. So it's 28, 2.8, 280, or 28 megapoints in total, and then that reduces as you increase the number of channels. So it says, for example, there 28, 14, 7, depending on the number of channels in use. It doesn't seem to get particularly slow. It does noticeably slow down a bit at the higher memory capacities, but certainly nothing that's too annoying really. The HDMI out just displays as a crop of the display on a higher resolution, which is fairly reasonable. It doesn't seem to try to rescale it or anything, but that works fine, say for presentations or if you want to run it through a projector. One thing that I've not yet figured out, there's this timestamp enable under capture. I haven't actually figured out what that does. I haven't found any sort of comprehensive manual for this yet. It's a fairly new product, so it may well be they haven't done that yet, but so that's the one thing I've yet to figure out exactly what that does. If anyone knows, please leave it in the comments. In terms of sort of general purpose buttons, you've got that's auto scale rather than auto norm on trigger mode. You've got run stop, single trigger, which is what you'd pretty much expect. There's also a force trigger in the trigger section. These up down buttons just change the trigger source. I'm not sure that's a particularly good use of buttons. I think things like a single button waveform intensity might have been better, but generally the button layout's fairly reasonable, and this scope I think would be entirely usable as both a bench and a portable scope. One disadvantage I found of using the T-Book Mini portable is because it's not the scope I normally use. There are certain things, because I don't use it very often off-site, there are just certain things I just can't remember how to get to. I'm not that familiar with it, so some of them it takes me a while sometimes to figure it out, whereas I think this scope would be quite usable as a bench scope and a portable scope, and certainly in terms of that functionality, it's probably quite significantly better value than anything else out there. I think that sort of pretty much covers most of it. So if you also look at the T-Book Mini review, there'll be pretty much everything that the T-Book Mini can do. This will also do, but with knobs on as well. Instead, the buttons are quite nice. If you look at the overall profile, they don't. It is recessed back here. They don't stick out very much. I mean, they're maybe 4mm in front of the front face, so I don't think they're particularly sort of huge risk in terms of getting knocked or getting damaged. They've got quite a nice sort of soft rubbery type feel to them. Actually, the rubber bits do actually come off, but they've got like the sort of detents that you'd expect. They're quite nice to use. Maybe if you've got really big fingers, then it might be a slight fiddle, but they stick out far enough from the buttons, and so because they've got this rubber on it, you just really need a fairly light touch, and you can turn them with one finger or two fingers with just fingertips. You don't need to really grab hold of them. They're very they move nice and smoothly, but there's enough detent for to actually feel the detent on there. So in terms of the actual ergonomics of the knobs, I think they've done a pretty decent job. I'm not totally sure about the layout. The fact the horizontal is sort of buried in the middle here rather than a bit more prominent, maybe. But I think it's really what you're used to. You know, with a limited amount of space, you always got to make compromises. So I don't think there's anything they've done here that's particularly problematic. And overall, you know, it's just a fairly sort of standard sort of hard plastic case. It doesn't, the T-Book Mini did have these sort of very slightly soft rubber bumpers on the outside. I don't know whether that actually gave it much protection in practice, so they've maybe just sort of tried to make it a bit more compact. I think it's maybe it just looks a little bit slicker with just sort of nice sort of clean corners. There's no attempt at any sort of weather or environmental proofing on this, and like the T-Book Mini, you do have this sort of hand grip on the side, so it is potentially usable sort of handheld. I think the problem is though it is quite heavy, so I think you certainly wouldn't be able to use that for extended periods of time without getting sort of quite a sort of sore arm. But it is usable like that. I'm not really sure how much you'd really want to do it, because obviously with the additional width it's even more, it's putting even more leverage on your handhold, so I'm not really sure how useful that handhold is. Covered most of the functionality of the thing. I think it's time to take a look inside. Unlike the T-Book Mini, it is a proper sort of completely self-contained battery. I believe the battery is, you can buy it without the battery, but I don't honestly know why you would, because the mobile usage is just so handy to have. It is held down by screws, so you do need to unscrew it to swap the battery, but 7,500 milliamp hour, 7.4 volt, and so lifetime it's about 5 hours of runtime. So taking the back off, there's a shielding plate here, and very nice clean layout. No, this is a fairly new product, showing a date of October 2018. No obvious mods or bodges anywhere. This is obviously the HDD. It's marked HAD 1511, so that's going to be the standard Hittite one that pretty much all low-end scopes use these days. This will be an FPGA. That was probably going to be a system on chip. Runs all the processor and everything. Various memories around it. As you expect, lots of these inductors for the various calculators all over the place. The speaker on the back. Really nothing particularly surprising in there. Not a great deal on the reverse side. A little Wi-Fi module here. Interestingly, it looks like there's a position there for some sort of chip antenna that's not populated, so it doesn't seem to be much in the way of antenna, but yeah, Wi-Fi range on something like this is probably not a huge deal, but I suspect the Wi-Fi performance is probably not great. A few various sort of bits of power supply stuff, and really not much else. I mean, there's really not a great deal in this. Interesting, the front end is all discrete. There's a an analog multiplexer chip here, but everything else is transistors. Have got a relay. This is a 100 megahertz model. There is a 150 megahertz, but only 2 channels, so that's probably a limitation of the HDD. We've got the usual solid state relay here for the AC/DC switching. There's one relay, and there's a few discrete transistor packages. That's sort of fairly simple. There's a button. I can imagine that button's probably a duplicate of the power button. There's a probe adjustment output on the side on these tags. Incidentally, there's the LAN mag jack here. Incidentally, I tried the LAN functionality. There doesn't appear to be any web server type functionality. That may be pending new firmware. It did actually appear as device, but gave a file error, so it could just be they haven't actually done that part of it yet. There's a little RTC backup battery down there. And the front panel button board is pretty much what you expect. There's a STM32F030 processor, coupled HC595 for I/O expansion, probably driving these LEDs, and just the encoders, so that's pretty much uneventful. And there's just the display, touchscreen controller, and that's the backlight connector, so that's all pretty much as you'd expect. So all in all, I think this is a really nice piece of kit. They've done sort of quite a reasonable job of adding the knob to the touchscreen scope. You can still use it pretty much entirely by touch if you want to, but you've got the addition of knobs for people that like knobs. If you're totally happy with touchscreen everything, then I think the T-Book Mini is still a very good good piece of kit, and if you want the smallest for portable use, then that may be a slightly better choice. But I think, you know, the addition of this is a quite useful addition. I suspect that some, if not all, of the extra features in this may well have integrated into the latest T-Book Mini software. I know they have implemented the serial decodes. Incidentally, the serial decode, the art decode, goes up to 8 megabaud, which is pretty decent. I've not really looked at the other decodes, but say the serial one seems to have been implemented pretty well, so no reason to think the others haven't also. So yeah, but so I think the addition of the knobs makes this a much more viable option to just have one scope that you use both on the bench and in the field, so you're familiar with it, and the operational facilities are pretty much what you'd get on pretty much any sort of other low to mid-end bench scopes. But say in this package you've got this nice big screen. Incidentally, the screen is not multi-touch. There's no sort of stretch gestures. It's literally touch and drag type thing. But to be honest, I think with multi-touch is of limited use on a scope because of the vertical orientation of the screen, the way it's normally used. That, you know, pinch gestures are quite uncomfortable to use. So I don't think that you're really missing much by not having those. So in terms of the touch screen, I think the only criticisms are there are a few things where I'd like to be able to type in values to get exact figures. They've got things like these fine controls which don't actually really do much else. They're just pretty much the same as the position controls. So I don't think that really adds a great deal. But yeah, most of it's pretty well implemented. I've not seen anything actively buggy. The build quality looks good, so yeah, I mean, I'd certainly recommend it. I've just had a quick look at availability. Micsig are being carried by some of the more mainstream test equipment manufacturers, like Batronics, Telonic, and probably some others. The only other place I've seen this model available now as of recording is on eBay. It doesn't appear to be on AliExpress, but say if you want to go to a reputable sort of test equipment manufacturer, a lot of them are actually stocking the Micsig range, so you can sort of go there and get support and maybe actually go and actually have a look at one. I've certainly seen Micsigs at quite a few electronics trade shows as well, so if you want to go and have a play with them, the fact they're carried by multiple distributors means that they are around, and if you want to, you can go and have a play. But no, very nice bit of kit. Say if you're looking for something that's small, lightweight, and also totally portable, I don't think I've really seen anything better. And there are some higher end portable scopes from some of the bigger name manufacturers, but you're looking at like 4, 5, 6 times the cost. Yeah, I think this is a pretty good value. The fact it gives you a pretty decent bench scope, plus the fact it's battery power and you can take it and use it wherever you want. So yes, highly recommended.